That's a really, really tough act to follow because he left us with a lot of different things to think about, about the energy future, about energy poverty, about the just transition, and all these really, cool buzzwords that are going around. And one of those buzzwords is environmental justice. And it is on the minds of a lot of people, maybe different things, means different things to different people, but that's what we're here to talk about today. So it's not really a shift from what he was talking about, but a little bit more about what he was talking about. So just to get started, my name is Uni Blake. I work at the American Petroleum Institute, and that's based in Washington, D.C. I thought I had traveled the longest distance. I don't know which is further, Houston or D.C., but Colorado is almost like my second home. I say that originally coming from Kenya, I don't do cold at all, but I've spent time up here in Colorado because of different reasons. Obviously, the legislative calendar as well as the regulatory work that's going on. So my background is in environmental health. I am a toxicologist with a training in public health, and I've spent the past almost 20 years working in the background in the oil and gas industry, and I own it. I mean, everybody asks me, what do you do? I work for the oil and gas industry. I don't hide it because I am really proud of all the work that people do in the industry, the guys that are out there in the middle of the Gulf or who knows what ocean, getting the oil that we need, the folks that are on the, on the sites onshore doing exploration and production, laying pipes, all of it, makes a big difference in a lot of people's lives. I come from one of those countries that was dark on that screen, and so as Dr. Tinker was talking about it, I take it very personally that we need to start having these kind of conversations about equity around energy use. And so with me today, I'll let them introduce themselves, but I wanted to start off by kind of level setting. So I said I work, I'm going to stand, I'm sorry. I'm terrible. Good. I'm terrible at sitting. So if I don't drop my mic. So I work in Washington, D.C., as you can imagine. And it's a little bit different there than being in Grand Junction, where I flew in. There's no Uber. I learned that my last trip. And same with Pueblo and the little towns, Greeley. So I've driven a huge part of this state. And I see this tremendous difference. But when we sit in our desks in DC, we don't see what you see. And so we come up with these big ideas about what we think needs to be done, or what we think these things mean, but they always mean something different when we're out here. So I sat on the Environmental Justice Advisory Task Force for a year, and I got to meet a lot of neat people in so many different parts of this country. Some of them operators, some of them environmental justice advocates, and it's almost like we're all trying to get to the same place, but we're all asking different questions to get there. And so part of my work that I do at API is to find ways to bring these conversations together so that EJ is not a bad word, so that EJ is something that means something, and it's an opportunity for industry, number one, to showcase the good things that we do in our communities. So it's not a thing that's trying to stop you from operating, but it's this opportunity that has been opened up for us. So I'm a note person, so I'm going to look at my notes real quick here. So my task to kind of start this conversation, like I said, was to kind of level set. And I just wanted to give this bigger picture of what's going on at the federal level and what's going on in the different states. And then I'll allow the folks from Colorado to talk about specifically what's going on in Colorado. So at the federal level, there's a lot of work going on, obviously. The federal agencies are relying on their authority that's under the executive orders. The first one that Bill Clinton put out, and then the ones that the current administration put out, to start incorporating environmental justice into all these larger regulations. I think we saw that NEPA is going to be one of them, and and there's several others. If you work anything under TSCA, which is the Toxic Chemical Act, which will impact some operators, and At the states, what we're seeing, states are convening task force. They're developing all these screening tools to try and identify communities. We're seeing that definitions are really important, and I know there's an exercise going on in Colorado now to try and define what an EJ community is. And that engagement with your community has to be meaningful. We don't know what meaningful means yet. It's a very subjective term. The public has to participate. Does that mean one person, two people, 100? So there's a lot of subjective conversations taking place. And ultimately, the decision is to make these regulations more equitable so that as you write regulations, certain groups of people are not impacted more. And so why are we doing all this? There is a legacy. And so there's a legacy of land use, and there's a legacy of regulatory programs. And it's the way it was set up. So a facility gets a permit, you do what you're supposed to do on your permit, and you're good, right? And that's what you've done for years. And that's one thing that operators always come back to me and ask me, well, my action is permitted, and so I think I'm okay, right? But things have changed. So the community has become more vocal. The community is starting to see things changing around them. They're starting to see, hey, wait a minute, why are we the only ones getting all this in our part of town, and that part of town they're not getting anything? And so is it a color issue? Is it an economic issue? Is it, what is the source of this vulnerability? And so those are some of the questions that I think a lot of people are still grappling with. If you go to the EPA, they look at it and say it's an income issue, a lower income issue. So communities where there's a lower income, that's kind of where everything has gone. Is it because of the regulations? Is it because of zoning? These are issues that will be settled at the local level. Unfortunately, folks from the local government, that's where all the fighting is going to take place, to try and solve all this. So it'll be industry, it'll be the communities, and it'll be the local government that will solve it. The EPA has already said that they know that potentially there's going to be a lot of lawsuits as they try and start, putting out some guidance from the federal level. But if local communities can work with the industries and with the public, we can solve the issues a lot quicker than waiting for the federal government. So there is a recognition that this is a very local issue. There is also another recognition that it is so different depending on the community that you're in. It is different in the sense that a community has different priorities. Some communities have relied on industry for time immemorial, others haven't, and industry is new, and that's not one of their priorities. And so each community is really, really different, and I think we need to recognize that. And then there's a big question about, so how do you identify an EJ community? What I'm seeing from the national level is less and less use of the word environmental justice, because environmental justice has its own history and its own implications. Environmental justice is founded in racism. And in some cases, what has been going on is not really tied to race. It's just, like I said, it's tied to siting, it's tied to all these different things that may not have anything to do with race, but do, in some cases, reflect a racial disparity. So I think it's important that we recognize that. So what you're seeing the Biden administration talk about now is equity. Let's talk about equity, and let's talk less about, environmental justice. So EJ is still an issue, but then the equity question comes in. And when you talk about equity, it has to do with recognizing certain communities have certain vulnerabilities. Whether the community is a retirement community, so you have people who are older than 65. I'm not saying that everybody over 65 has like a health condition, but they have these other sensitivities that may affect how they respond to pollution or how they respond to a change in their quality of life. Or you could be in a community that has an elevated asthma risk. Or you could find yourself operating in a community that has vulnerabilities associated with the lack of health care or green space or something like that. So the question has always come for me from industry. In fact, I've heard it here today and yesterday. Do they expect us to build a hospital, to build a school? Where is it going to stop? Because these communities have a lot of disparities, is it the job of the industry to take care of that? So I think Tyson's going to have to answer that question for us. Or is it the job of the state? Now, who's supposed to solve these problems? And so that's one of the big questions. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up was, put my glasses on for this one here. You know, this happens when you hit 50, so there you go. So the use of the tools. So Colorado has EnviroScreen, is what they call it, EnviroScreen. Obviously, the federal government has EJ-Screen. California has their tool. A lot of different states have tools. Now we're seeing federal agencies developing their own tools. Department of Transportation, Department of Energy has a dashboard. And so for people that, companies that operate across the country, it's a challenge because the tools are all different. And so there's an expectation that you're supposed to do something, but there's all these different tools. Which one do you use? How do you know that you're getting to the right community? How do you know that you're doing the right thing? And so hopefully our conversation today will help us get there. So missing from the podium is the representative from the local government. And it's something I thought about for a long time, you know, to bring somebody up to kind of represent the local government. But then, based on what I just said, is y'all are all in different situations. And so one person up here would not be able to answer the question. So what we're going to try today as a part of this conversation, and I call it a conversation, is throw questions out to you as an audience for folks who are at the local level to help us understand some of the things that you're dealing with, some of your challenges, and some of the opportunities that you see where we can start working on it together. And I think this is a good mix of crowd to have that conversation. So I'm going to close my opening right there and allow Tyson and Trish to introduce themselves and give them a few more minutes to talk about what they do. And yeah.
Please,
Can
Trisha.
I go first? Okay. Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Trisha Oeth. I'm our Director of Environmental Health and Protection at Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, or CDPHE. Really excited and grateful to be part of this discussion here today and with all of you. This has been a really a great day with a lot of rich discussion and continuing here, which I'm grateful for. Just to kind of fill in, or at least sort of provide a blanket set of what is happening in terms of environmental justice work at the state level. I would maybe start with sharing that back in 2021, the Colorado General Assembly passed the Environmental Justice Act, and that really created a lot of opportunities and for this work, and then housed the responsibilities at our department at CDPHE, and a couple of foundational components to getting this environmental justice work underway here in Colorado. And so there's kind of three pillars that I think of when I think of the Environmental Justice Act. And so those include sort of the establishment of an Environmental Justice Action Task Force. So Uni mentioned this earlier. Uni, Tyson, and I were three of the members of the task force, but there were 20-some members that comprised this group that met over the course of a year. And really it was under the auspice of, we don't know the answers yet, and so let's convene a diverse group of people to start talking about the issue and work through conversation to come up with some recommendations that were then shared with the General Assembly and the governor around environmental justice. And so the work of that task force wrapped up in November of last year, and since then, I would say, the state has kind of started implementing or is approaching implementation of those recommendations in three different phases. So first, we took a look at the recommendations and assessed, which of those recommendations are things that we at CDPHE can start to implement right now, within our current resources, within our current authorities, and we've already started that work. And so a couple of examples of that would be around a recommendation that CDPHE really serve as kind of a coordinating and convening entity among state agencies, making sure that we are all talking with one another about our environmental justice work. Another is really getting underway our connections with community connectors and community advisors. And so we have formal established relationships with a number of community connector groups throughout Colorado who really help us understand what are the particular perspectives and concerns within different communities in Colorado. Another example, I guess, is establishing metrics for improving health disparities, because that's ultimately, I think, one of the pillars of this work is how do we improve the health and lives of people who are bearing a disproportionate burden of environmental pollution here in Colorado. So that's kind of phase one of, what are the things that recommendations from this diverse group that we can start working on right away. The second phase is to get at a topic that Uni raised, which is which communities are considered disproportionately impacted communities here in Colorado, or DI communities, as often it's the short version of the phrase. And so right now in statute there are multiple definitions. I think there's 4 or 5 definitions that apply across 6 or 7 different state agencies in Colorado, which can be very confusing. And so a recommendation of the task force and a priority for us is to work this legislative session on a bill that would combine those and also provide a little bit of flexibility for agencies to determine in various cases which of the factors that go into defining a disproportionately impacted community may make sense in different scenarios. For example, you might want to be looking at the factors differently if you're looking at who is eligible for a grant opportunity than in other types of situations. So that's kind of the second phase. And then the third phase, there are a number of the recommendations from the task force that are really longer term and that the task force probably grappled with the most. And so the one that comes to mind for me the most is around how do we deal with cumulative impacts, right? So there was a discussion this morning around cumulative impacts, and that was a big component of this task force's conversation. And ultimately, the task force recommended that there ought to be a way to try to get our arms around doing like a comprehensive equity assessment by neighborhood in a way that none of the agencies alone are going to be able to do, right? We at CDPHE, we have air quality and water quality expertise, but we don't understand necessarily impacts to a community from transportation or healthcare access or food access, things like that. But all of those pieces come together to create, the real experience in communities. Excuse me. And so that was a recommendation of the task force that those types of analyses be done. But we still need to flesh out kind of how they would be done, what the scope of them are, and then what do we do with them to actually affect change and improve conditions. So that's the third phase, is that we'll be working on a stakeholder process throughout the course of this year on that piece. Excuse me. So going back to the Environmental Justice Act, the first part was the standing up of the Environmental Justice Action Task Force and its recommendations. So that's what I was just talking about. The second pillar is about the creation of an Environmental Justice Advisory Board. So this is a board that of, I think, maybe 9 members or so who have been appointed and who will continue to serve for an extended period of time and really serve as advisors for questions around environmental justice in the state. But included in the scope of their work and authorities is the distribution of grant funding. And so the board just awarded about $1 million out to 8 different grant recipients who had applied for the funding to do projects in their communities to improve environmental justice conditions in their communities. So it's something the local government folks in the audience, if you haven't been aware of that, that is an opportunity, and another round of funding will get kicked off later this year. So that will be an ongoing source of funding and work that will be coming out of our agency. And then a third pillar from the Environmental Justice Act was the establishment of an environmental justice ombudsperson within our agency. And so this is a person who works at CDPHE, but it really functions as an independent person and is a resource and a liaison with community members. So all of our agencies can be quite complicated to navigate, and it can be frustrating to know where to go to if you have a complaint or concern. You can feel like it goes into a black box. And so the ombudsperson really is someone that community members can go to as their primary resource to help them navigate if they're having an issue. And our ombudsperson has been creating a complaint system so that when the agency does receive complaints around environmental justice, they come into one place. It's very transparent with the communities about what the agency has been hearing and how that complaint has been resolved. And so that complaint system is just underway of getting launched. I believe the public comment period on kind of a beta version is underway right now, and so we're excited to get kind of its first version out there and functioning. So with that, I will turn to Tyson to share some of his thoughts.
My name is Tyson Johnston. I'm the Vice President of Land and Regulatory for Gunnison Energy. I used to be almost 7 foot tall. I'm shrinking now. I was a great high school player, terrible in college, so you don't need to Google me. But I've been in the oil and gas industry for about 20 years. I actually started my career as a field landman, working in various places in North Dakota and Montana, Wyoming. And got my first job as an in-house landman with PDC Energy up here out of Parachute, where we used to have a property that's now run by Karis. So I kind of started out here, and it's good to be back out here. I consider myself to be a part of that radical middle. Is that what we're calling it? As Mr. Tinker said. I've been an advocate for natural gas for a long, long time, and believe that it can have massive impacts, especially as we talk about disparities, income disparities and things of that nature. So most of my external work outside of oil and gas is spent working with the Black and brown communities in Denver, working on things like environmental justice, trying to find the right way to approach these subjects, because these are uncomfortable subjects. People don't want to talk about environmental racism, redlining. The gentleman with the Southern Ute tribe. The injustices that have happened in the past, we can ponder on them, or we can find ways to move forward. So I'm really a solutions-oriented person. This was a great opportunity to get with a big, diverse group of people. I was co-chair with Ian Thomas DeFoya, who is the head of the Green Latinos and about as opposite in professional career as I could be. So that ability to sit down and talk and listen, more importantly, to the diverse groups of people, all of the citizens that we talk to hear their concerns, kind of opened my eyes to a lot of different things, including education and lack of data and lack of understanding, as well as the need to understand certain aspects of what we do in an industry, as well as how other industries operate and work. So I think the overall thought process of EJ can be very confusing, especially as we talk about how does this affect you various people in the room who are from all over the state of Colorado. And I think one of the things you need to understand is kind of the sole purpose of this, because it really was to focus on a specific group of people that up till now was really only defined by income. And to say that, okay, there's this specific group of people that if with these disparities that don't allow them to be at public hearings, or they're working 2 jobs, they're not affluent enough to pay for lawyers or help, or someone to help assist them in understanding what's going on in and around them. So my focus in this was really to try and hone in on that, and how can we create a way to level the playing field for people's voices to be heard, people who aren't backed by a large environmental EDF, for instance, or are not backed by industry, or are not backed by somebody else. They're able to come up and have a conversation and have their voice heard. So that for me was the focus along this entire journey that we went on, was how can we do that? And I think for the most part, in all of the recommendations, we really tried to capture those ways to provide the DI communities an ability to raise themselves up and have a voice in some of this stuff. There were definitely proponents of having the ability to cancel things and get rid of power plants and I don't think that was the overall intent when you look at what we put into this document. And what it was recommendations for the legislature, because most of the rules and regulations that we operate under are a function of legislation or rulemakings, and all of those have a process. So it wasn't like we had the authority or the power to come in there and say, we're going to do it this way, we're going to do it this way, we're going to do it this way. We had to put forth recommendations so that the correct process could take place to resolve these issues. So I think my biggest message to everyone out here is understand that this is happening, this is going on, and you need to be a participant in it. Because the rule makings, the legislation that is coming out now, as the definition of DI communities comes out and is adopted throughout the agencies, and how those agencies implement them in their rulemakings is going to be the crux of what this is actually for. Is it going to be something that is used to help uplift these communities, or is it going to be something that is misused as a means to try and change a certain regulation or rule, or prevent an industry from flourishing in a particular area? So it's very key that the end result is correct. If it's not, then the purpose of what we did isn't going to be seen. That's all I have.
Really?
I mean, I only talked for 4.5 minutes.
Oh, no. I thought you'd keep going. Everybody knows Tyson talks a lot, right? So I was getting ready for the long haul over there, to see what else you had to say. So, you talked about the Environmental Justice Advisory Task Force and some of the work that we did. I sat on the committee that looked at data. I think one of the challenges was a lot of environmental justice advocates show up at meetings, and they kind of say the same thing, and we've heard it at different times. And I know folks in the local government here, they talk about family members that have cancer or family members that are sick, and they talk about it, and they say, what are you going to do about it? And a typical response for me, from being a very technical person, I'm like, show me your data. How many people out of how many, and things like that. And so our group really, really focused on data gaps. Where are the data gaps? How can we get to the data that answers these questions, or the data that really makes us look at operations, or look at how we are zoning, or what it is that we're doing? And so with that thought in mind, what do you think is another priority for industry to be able to, work with local governments to address some of those concerns being raised? I know that was one of our questions, I'm sorry.
Well, I guess from an industry standpoint, I think the education and the data piece is huge. I think you're starting to see it from some of the larger companies, but participating in the data gathering, understanding that we have data gaps, and when there's data gaps, there's really nothing to, you can't even dispute certain claims if you don't have data. So helping with that data gathering, finding ways to, I know we've got new solutions with flyover emissions and all types of things that can be done, but actively participating in those discussions, in those rulemakings, in those, if there are projects that can be funded, helping to fund those projects, so we can actually have data that does that. That's a piece of it, but then there's the social aspect of it too. And I think the social aspect is the tougher piece, and I think a lot of that social aspect has come from the privacy and secrecy that we've had as an industry for many, many years. And I know we've changed that a lot over the last decade, but you know, every time I go to a rulemaking, I'm still hearing stories from 2008, 2006, 2005, knowing what's changed in our rules. I've been part of every rulemaking the COGC has had since 2008, and I'm really proud of what the COGC has done to this point to create more protections for people. I mean, we used to have open pits, we used to have all of these things that don't exist anymore. And we do have the cleanest molecules in the country. I'm convinced we do. I don't know that data for a fact, but I'd be curious to see that. So, you know, it goes back to, you know, involving the community, working with the community, not trying to work against the community, because you're always going to have people who don't want us here, period. But if you just try to shut them out and shut them up, it's going to work out the exact opposite of what you expect.
You gonna take a stab at it? Trisha?
So yeah, well, I guess I would have two things I would want to say about data. One is, you know, we hear from some communities a need for more data. They feel like there is a lack of data in their community to help inform decisions and help inform and understand what the impacts are and what they're experiencing in their community. And then on the flip side, sometimes we hear from communities who say, you know, stop trying to collect data. We don't need data to help us understand or to know that we've been disproportionately impacted. We want action. So, you know, I think there's sort of a push-pull there. And then the other thing I would say about data is, you know, that there are other times where we have a lot of data, and the data might show that, you know, air pollution levels are not exceeding health thresholds or health-based limits, but people are experiencing symptoms, right? And so how do you know, we struggle with, then how do you address and resolve and respond to real symptoms that people are experiencing when the data is not showing that, you know, that there has been exceedance of these type of limits? And I think we don't know the answer to that yet. I think that's something that we're really grappling with right now.
You know, there's a word that you mentioned, communication. So there's this idea that, like when we were doing the Environmental Justice Advisory Task Force, and we would show up at a city, and a lot of people didn't know we were there. So I just wanted like a show of hands. Did everybody know there was an EJ Advisory Task Force that met for almost a year and developed recommendations? See, there's still some people that didn't know that. And so there is that problem with communication, because those recommendations impact all of you, whether you're local government or you know, you're in the industry. So then how do we start engaging people better? Because that's one of the key issues or problems with the whole equity conversation, is that people are just not being engaged on these issues. So what is CDPHE doing to try and build that communication piece?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's absolutely right. And Tyson, you got to this as well, right? The importance of hearing from new voices and really engaging and bringing people to the table and to the conversation who have not previously been part of the conversation. And so we have a couple of things that we're doing, but I think the thing that seems like it's primarily the most effective is really individual type of trust building and relationship. And so I mentioned earlier our environmental justice ombudsperson who, you know, is really out there traveling around the state and meeting with different members of communities all throughout the state and building those relationships. And similarly within our environmental justice program, you know, we have, you know, people living with, you know, in different parts of the state and, you know, capitalizing on relationships from having grown up in those communities and being engaged in those communities and knowing who the leaders are and how to get, you know, the word out to people about, you know, what are the things happening in terms of this topic and other environmental things that you know, may impact their lives. And then I guess one final thing is, you know, sort of utilizing our work with the community connectors to organize trainings for people to help them understand, okay, you know, Air Quality Control Commission has a rulemaking coming up, here, we want you to be aware of it, help you understand what they're considering, and here's how you as an individual can participate, here's how you can provide your comments and your feedback and really be a part of the conversation.
Okay, that's good. You want to add something on that, Tyson?
No, I mean, I think the communication is tough, and not only is the communication tough, but there's also that question of, is this really important? Yeah, I think we've seen it in many cases from an industry standpoint where we look at something and we're like, yeah, that's not really important, and all of a sudden it's very important. This is one of those topics. It's an extremely important topic because it is going to affect the way industry does business. It is going to affect the way counties and municipalities create rules and, you know, develop their industries, whatever type of industry that may be. So it has a much farther reach than just oil and gas. So it's crucial that people do understand what the proposed definition is, why it was put in there like that. It's a more comprehensive definition to capture just a more comprehensive group of disproportionately impacted individuals. But then you've also got you know, the implementation of that and how that goes through in your rulemakings and in your city and county rulemakings, and to ensure that we're covering that topic and making sure that it's static. Because you've brought up before that there's federal versions, there's a Colorado version, how those are going to interplay with federal grant money and state grant money, and how your individual municipalities operate and function. I mean, this provides a huge opportunity for your DI communities in your respective counties, because there are grant programs to help these communities. This isn't a quick fix. This isn't a snap your finger, everything disappears. This is going to take mitigation, minimization, and avoidance where we can to help clean up these communities and provide them you know, a better health situation.
You know, it's interesting that you talk about grant money. I was going to say that in the beginning, but I didn't. So the federal government, EPA, was allocated out of the Inflation Reduction Act, $3 billion to kind of address climate and environmental justice. That's $3 billion. And I think it's important that local government recognizes that different groups within your jurisdiction will be applying for that funding. And some of that funding is going to go directly into, let's say, air quality programs. And it's more of the community-based engagement groups that will be collecting air quality. But it gives you an opportunity to know who is in your community and to know what they're doing within your community. I don't know how you would set that up, but just be aware that there's going to be a lot of money flowing into your communities from these federal programs. EPA, to the point, actually set up the Environmental Justice Office. It's no longer like a small division, but it's a nationwide office, just like the Office of Air, Office of Water. Now we have the Office of Environmental Justice and Civil Rights, which we haven't even touched on. And that office now went from a staff of like 36 to over 200 people now working EJ at the federal level. And some of those folks are going to be out in the different regional offices working environmental justice. And so while you may not be feeling it right now, just know it's coming. All you have to do is go to USA.gov and put in EJ, and you see how the federal government is hiring people all over the country to work environmental justice and equity issues. And so that's just kind of an FYI. So we have just a few minutes left. I was hoping we'd do better than this. But I would like to hear from some folks in local jurisdictions about if they're seeing any of these concerns, what they look like, or just general questions.
Right here.
Yeah, I'm Tom Jankowski. I'm Garfield County Commissioner. And I guess when you look at our county, the west end of our county has the lowest income, the most poverty, but it's also the area that has oil and gas production. I'm really concerned about, well, first of all, I'm concerned about our state legislature for many reasons, where we have urban legislators, urban governor making rules and regulations for rural Colorado and rules and regulations that can hurt us. And I think this has the potential to do that. And I appreciate Tyler saying that, you know, this can be used or misused. And I just look at it, if you were to have these rules and regulations around the west end of our county where we need jobs, and more rules and regulations, the higher cost of doing business is, so we don't have jobs. And the individuals then that are in these communities have to drive an hour and a half each way to resort jobs, that there's no justice in that, and there's no justice for their children. The pay is not as good as if they could have a good job in their own neighborhood. And so, Uni, I appreciate you saying that it's different for each community, and I really am concerned that these rules and regulations are just going to exasperate something that's already there.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the main topics that I think we brought up multiple times during these meetings was the difference between rural and urban Colorado, and each side of the state, each corner of the state is very, very different. The tools that we've set up through the recommendations, EnviroScreen, you know, those, again, how they get implemented in the rules is very important. The EnviroScreen is a screening tool, and it needs to be utilized as a screening tool, which means that each governing body is going to have what happens after the screening tool is used to continue that, as well as the local governments, and how do you ensure that you're following what needs to be followed, and also making sure that you're not doing blanket. I mean, some of the census blocks that are utilized to collect that data are very large, and when it may be, you know, a single community down by the river that is actually causing that to be a DI community, and that operation may be far away from that. So, and how it gets implemented. Just remember that DI communities are already in the COGC rules and regulations. This definition is going to include some other communities, but as of now, when we talked to the COGCC, there were no permits approved or even submitted within DI communities as the map sits now. So that may change over time, and probably will, but how we can do things to minimize, mitigate, and keep you know, the interactions between industry and the DI communities, you know, going side by side is going to be critical.
Okay, I think Kirby's over there. He's getting ready to give us a hook. So
I have the microphone, Kirby. I'm going to ask a question.
Okay.
All the people go on the field tour need to be leaving here in 60 seconds
Okay.
to make their timeline.
Quickly, and this Director Oeth and Tyson, feel free to fill in. Kim Cook from Oxy. You know, one of the things that we talked about a lot, and you mentioned this, you know, local governments and that coordination with local governments. CDPHE doesn't have any siting authority when it comes to development, whether that's oil and gas, although COGCC and local governments have dual authority. That's a conference all in itself. But when you're looking at, or I would say having this audience here, what would be your ask to the local governments to work with you on that, given that for any type of development, aside from oil and gas, they are the siting authority, and then you are then implementing and trying to regulate environmental justice issues. What would be your ask from the state agency to the local governments?
Thanks so much for that question, Kim. And that's right, you know, as on the Environmental Justice Action Task Force, there was supposed to be a representative from local government for exactly that reason, right? How important it is for those of you in local government to be engaged and part of this conversation, because, right, like, there are some situations about where there are facilities already located in a disproportionately impacted community, but then there's what are the opportunities moving forward to avoid additional impacts or adding to those impacts. But I'd also add, it's about thinking about opportunities for benefits as well, right? So we talked a lot about how it's not all about deficits for environmental justice, but it's all about equity to access to environmental benefits as well. So, you know, I think it's just really important for all of us to be collaborating both on, you know, what are the decisions within your authorities in terms of citing and deciding where, you know, certain types of growth and development should occur in your communities, and as well as where should, you know, how to equitably distribute the benefits in your community.
And I would just add that you got to participate. You got to participate in the rulemakings. You got to participate in the legislation. You need to be reaching out to the representatives at the Capitol. There's legislation out there right now that's going to have an effect on this, and understanding that many governments want to remain in control of their local authorities. There are also legislation out there that is potentially pulling that back a little bit, and you need to be aware of that. So, you know, again, this is a tool that's specifically meant for a specific group of people. But if you're not paying attention and you don't assist in the process, it could end up taking that benefit away from this group of people we're trying to help.
Okay. We've been given the hook. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.